This is the read aloud for Dateline Troy, the Iliad. Page 8 begins here. You can see on the bottom. The north wind noses through the rubble that was Troy. Mighty Achilles has been dead for millennia. Ravishing Helen, old King Priam, truth-telling Cassandra, all have lain long in their graves if indeed they actually lived. The siege and sack of Troy is old news, more than 3,000 years old. The story was ancient even to the ancient Greeks who sang it from memory. Yet sing it, then write it, and read it they did, as have innumerable talebearers since. The first book to be printed in English appeared in 1475 and recounted the Trojan War. In 1873, the site of Troy was discovered in western Turkey, facing Greece across the Aegean Sea. The city, long thought mythical, was real. Listeners and readers have always found real human nature in what had transpired there. Envy-maddened Ajax, love-struck Paris, crafty Odysseus, and all the others have walked the earth in every age and place. They live among us today. Though their tale comes from the distant Bronze Age, it's as current as this morning's headlines. The Trojan War is still being fought. Simply open a newspaper. Page 10. Page 10. It began with a nightmare. Hecuba, queen of Troy, was with child. The night before birth, she awoke shrieking. "The fire," she cried out, "it spreads." King Priam bolted up. There was no fire. Hecuba had been dreaming. Shaking, she stammered what she'd dreamt, that instead of bearing a child, she'd brought forth a tangle of flaming snakes. "Send for Calchas," commanded Priam. Old feet shuffled through the palace. Priest of Apollo, interpreter of omens, reader of dreams and the future, Calchas gave ear to the queen. "The vision speaks plainly," he pronounced. "The child will bring fire and ruin upon Troy. There's but one course of action." He peered at the queen, then the king. "When it's born, cut the infant's throat." Page 12. At first light, Hecuba gave birth to a boy. She held him until noon, weeping all the while. Priam at last took the baby from her arms, but couldn't bring himself to kill him. Still, he knew what must be done. He had a herdsman brought to his palace and entrusted him with the child and the deed. "Take him high on Mount Ida," he instructed. "Seek an untraveled spot and leave him." He touched his son's face, then the rattle his wife had pressed into his tiny hand. He turned away. The herdsman obeyed and left the infant to die. 5 days later, he returned to the place and gaped. No crow-pecked corpse lay before him, but a living baby being suckled by a she-bear. Amazed, sure the boy was fated to live, the man carried him home to his wife. The next day, as he walked to Troy and presented Priam with a dog's tongue as proof that the prince was dead, he returned to his hut. He would raise the child in secret. He and his wife named him Paris. Page 14. The lad grew up hardy, handsome, and as quick with his wits as his feet. He tended cattle, unaware that he was a prince. When the herdsmen set their bulls to fight, fair-minded Paris was often asked to judge the winner. Zeus, chief among the gods, watching from his palace on Mount Olympus, took note of the young man. It was at this time that the gods attended the wedding of the sea goddess Thetis. They'd all been invited with one exception. Eris, the spiteful goddess of strife, had been shunned. Incensed, she plotted her retaliation, and in the midst of the festivities, she flung a golden apple into the throng. Written upon it were the words, "For the fairest." Zeus's wife Hera assumed it was meant for her. Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle, boasted that her own beauty outshone Hera's. Appalled, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, insisted the apple should be hers. Their quarrel grew vicious, halting the feast. Watching Eris grinned. Finally, Zeus had to be called on to choose the most comely of the three. He eyed them, knowing that the two he passed over would make his life a misery. He longed to pass the task to another. And then he remembered Paris. Page 16. How can I choose without favor? Asked Zeus. Hera is my wife and Athena my own daughter. He handed the apple to Hermes, the god's messenger, and sent him winging away. The Trojan herdsman Paris will judge instead. He's much admired for his impartial decisions. You'll find him on Mount Ida. Grazing his cattle, Paris was agape when Hermes appeared and announced Zeus's will. He humbly tried to decline, but was refused. A moment later, the goddesses alit. They disrobed before a dumbstruck Paris. Nervously, he regarded Hera first. Award me the apple, she coaxed, and I'll make you emperor of all Asia. Athena next promised to make him the wisest of men and invincible in war. Then he came to Aphrodite. I can make you emperor as well, of the heart, and invincible in love. Name the woman and she shall be yours. Paris paused, distracted by this offer. Queen Helen of Sparta, for instance, Aphrodite continued, the most beautiful woman in all the world, whose looks approach even my own. Paris gazed upon the goddess's body, imagining she were Helen and his. And then he remembered, but Helen is married. My magic will make her as a moth and you a lantern. She'll follow you, entranced with passion, leaving her husband at home without a thought. Paris's judgment buckled beneath the weight of this bribe. He took a step back. I find Aphrodite the fairest, he announced, and placed the golden apple in her palm. She nodded at him, sealing their pact, and gave her rivals a superior smile. Hera fumed. Athena's eyes blazed. Furious with Paris, the two stalked off, vowing revenge on him and all Trojans. This is an important part. Page 18. The following day, his mind whirling with the thoughts of Helen, Paris strode off toward Troy. An athletic competition was to be held there that afternoon. His foster father tried to dissuade him, but ended up walking with him to the city. Excuse me. It was the first time Paris had set foot in Troy. He began the competition by entering the boxing contest, and to the surprise of all, defeated Priam's son, Zo. The proud-hearted princes were unaccustomed to losing, yet Paris flew past them in the foot race as well. At once, they demanded a second race to be run. Paris left them behind again. Infuriated, they decided to kill him and drew their swords. Paris dashed for his life. His foster father threw himself before Priam. Stop them, your majesty, he cried. That youth is your own lost son. Priam recognized the old man, halted his sons, and rushed up to Paris. He stared into his face. Hecuba followed. The herdsman produced the silver rattle he'd found in the infant's hands years before. The king and the queen knew at once. Both burst out weeping, clutching Paris. The old herdsman had feared he'd be punished. But that night, Priam invited him to a magnificent banquet to mark his son's return. When the seer Calchas heard the news, he and Apollo's other priests again warned the king to put Paris to death. Never, replied Paris. Better that Troy should burn than my precious son should die. Page 20. Paris exchanged his dirt-floored hut for a room of polished stone in the palace. Soon afterward, Menelaus, king of Sparta, chanced to visit Troy. Knowing that he was Helen's husband, Paris prodded him, heart-pounding, to describe his bewitching wife. He so shrewdly cultivated the king's friendship that Menelaus invited the prince to accompany him home and be his guest in turn. Feverish with joy, Paris accepted. Aphrodite sent their ship fair winds. They reached Sparta and marched up toward the palace. A woman stood in wait. Paris approached, then halted in awe. Flesh bested fancy. She had the grace of a deer and a dewdrop's radiance. He feared that such an earthly wonder would take no notice of a cowherd prince. Had Aphrodite cast her promised spell? He watched as the queen embraced her husband. The goddess, however, had been true to her word. Helen set her eyes upon Paris and fell instantly, irresistibly, in love. For 9 days, Paris feasted with his hosts. He yearned to shout out his love for Helen and wrote her name in wine spilled on the table. Menelaus, cast down by the news that his father had just died in Crete, took no notice. On the 10th morning, he departed for the funeral. The lovers exulted at their good fortune. Paris had first imagined Helen and then beheld. At last, he'd be able to touch her. Love maddened, the two decided to leave Sparta that night and never return. Page 22. In darkness, the pair carried the palace treasures aboard their ship and set off. They headed for Troy, but Hera, pouncing on the chance to punish Paris for denying her the golden apple, raised a great storm that blew them far off course. They landed at Cyprus and stayed several months, fearing that Menelaus lay in wait off Troy. They then sailed to the island of Sidon, whose king Paris murdered and whose coffers he emptied, adding vast stores of gold to their hold. At last they reached Troy, welcomed by cheers and celebrations. The Trojans were dazzled not only by the riches, but by Helen, more exquisite than any gem. Captivated, they swore never to see her returned. Hadn't the Greeks refused to send back Priam's own sister, carried away from Troy by a band of Greeks years before? And as for the priests who joined Calchas in urging that Paris be killed, Paris silenced them with generous gifts of gold to Apollo's temple. Only one voice was raised against Paris. It came from his own sister, Cassandra, a prophetess who'd been doomed by the god Apollo never to be believed. Over and over, she'd warned Priam not to let Paris travel to Sparta. Now she declared that a frightful war would result unless Helen were sent back at once. The king listened patiently to his daughter. Then, as he had many times before, he sent her away, ignoring her words. Quick note, Cassandra is a prophetess who's doomed to never be believed. That means she's telling the truth. She knows what's going to happen, but she is doomed to never be believed. So she actually is somebody who can see the future, but nobody believes her. Page 24. Following his father's funeral, Menelaus had sailed home from Crete. No Helen waited to welcome him. His trusted guest was gone as well. In a fury, he stormed through the looted palace, astounded at Paris's treachery. And then he remembered the oath. This is important. Years back, when Helen had reached marriageable age, a flock of suitors, vocab word, had descended on Sparta. Many were kings and princes. All were drunk with desire so dangerously that her father had feared that the one he chose would be murdered by the others. To keep their swords sheathed, he proposed an oath. Each suitor would swear to defend Helen's husband against any man who tried to steal her away. Since all had hoped to gain this protection, each of them had taken the oath. He'd then given Helen to the wealthiest of her wooers, Menelaus. Enraged to picture her now with Paris, Menelaus sped north to the city of Mycenae. He burst forth with the news to his brother Agamemnon, the High King, the most powerful of all the Greek rulers, and reminded him of the suitors' pledge. Agamemnon, married to Helen's sister, listened to the tale in shock. At once he sent heralds to all the former suitors, calling them to make good on their oaths. Each would contribute soldiers or ships, making up a vast army and fleet. Though the walls were towering and thick, Troy would be taken, he vowed, and Helen with it. All right, that is the read aloud for part 1. And thank you for listening.